Throughout history there have been many recorded miracles. Oftentimes modern knowledge can offer possible explanations. Other times they can be ascribed to creative license and misunderstandings of authors of the past. An exception to this would be miracles occurring in modern times with no possible explanations. As famously written in Sherlock Holmes, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The following is a story with no possible scientific explanations. It's the early 1980s in a Wheaton, Illinois home. A young woman named Barbara Snyder lay on her bed, multiple tubes running through her body, responsible for keeping her alive. She had one that fed air into her lungs to keep her breathing despite her collapsed lung. Another tube brought nutrients to her stomach as she was unable to eat. Her limbs were atrophied and largely useless. Her hands and feet were curled to the limit. Her entire body was stuck folded in a permanent fetal position. These were symptoms of her very severe case of progressive multiple sclerosis, an incurable disease. Barbara was in bad shape and her inevitable next pneumonia infection would likely be her last. News of Barbara's situation reached the local Christian radio station and they aired it on a program they ran asking for prayers and letters for terminally ill patients. The response was overwhelming. Barbara received so many letters that her Aunt Ruthie, who delivered a mail bag full of them, had trouble even carrying it. Ruthie stayed with Barbara for a time and read her some of the letters, full of prayers for Barbara's healing. After Ruthie left, she was visited by two friends who came by after church. They mostly made small talk to Barbara, who had so little energy that the most she could do was listen to the conversation, rarely speaking herself. It was at this time, the afternoon of Sunday, June 7, 1981, that Barbara's miraculous healing occurred. Barbara and her two friends were alone in the room when there was a lull in the conversation. Behind Barbara's shoulder a compassionate male voice spoke to her. "My child, get up and walk." Barbara instinctively knew that only she had heard the voice. She wanted to share this with her friends, and when the hole in her neck was plugged so she could speak, she told them, "I don't know what you're going to think about this, but God just told me to get up and walk." Her friends were quiet, not sure how to respond, but Barbara knew what she had heard and she immediately asked them to go and get her family. Her friends, hearing the urgency in her voice, quickly went to the door and called for her family to come, but Barbara couldn't wait anymore. She jumped out of her bed and pulled her oxygen tube from her throat. Barbara stood on legs that hadn't been able to support her for years. Her feet that had been so curled she couldn't even wear slippers rested flat on the ground. She saw her healthy hands that hadn't worked, in front of her eyes that hadn't been able to see. Barbara spent a short amount of time coming to terms with her once crippled body now being completely healthy. Barbara walked out of her room where she was first met by her mother, who noticed that her once atrophied muscles had returned in full. Her father came next, whisking her off her feet to dance around the family room, while a confused and distressed therapist tried to restart Barbara's oxygen before realizing the miracle that had occurred. Barbara was so ecstatic, she sat down and stood up many times before she could settle down enough to stay seated for her mother's joyous prayer. That night, Barbara was excited and anxious for evening service at her church. She wanted to reveal the miracle of God's grace to all of her church friends. Barbara had been bedridden for so long that she didn't have any clothes suitable for church. She had long since donated anything she had before, never expecting to be able to wear a dress or shoes again. A kind-hearted neighbor lended her their own clothes and shoes to wear. Now healthy and properly dressed for the first time in years, she headed to Wheaton Wesleyan Church for her big reveal. Barbara bounded up to her church where Pastor Bailey was leading the worship. She waited in the back of the church until Pastor Bailey asked if there were any announcements from the congregation. Barbara then made her way to the front as the rest of the congregation slowly began to realize who was up and walking to the front. Pastor Bailey and the whole congregation were shocked for a time. A woman they had seen progressively getting closer and closer to death was standing before them, completely recovered, as if the illness was a lie. As Barbara reached the front of the aisle, the congregation all spontaneously began to sing Amazing Grace, celebrating her healing. The congregation, having seen her miracle, had all been inspired to sing the same song. Barbara would visit her doctor the next day. Her doctor was so shocked at the sight of her walking without any sign of multiple sclerosis that he initially believed she had died and he was seeing her ghost. To someone so intimately familiar with her medical history up to that point, a ghost was far more believable than a complete recovery. After several tests, it was found that her collapsed lungs had completely returned to a healthy state. The symptoms of multiple sclerosis which had plagued Barbara for years had completely vanished, leaving even her doctors to conclude it was the result of divine intervention. Barbara would go on to live a completely normal and healthy life. Barbara got married, had children and even grandchildren. Barbara lived a full and happy life, passing away in September 2021 at the age of 71. Barbara's story is as miraculous as they come. Her doctors said it was medically impossible. This was not a gradual remission. Barbara was instantly healed without any remaining symptoms of her incurable disease. It has eyewitness accounts, both written and in video. It has medical documentation showing the true facts of the situation, before and after the healing. It has Barbara herself testifying that God told her to get up and walk at the exact time of her healing. Every piece of evidence points directly to God. Thank you for watching. If you would like to see more of these videos, please like and subscribe.